Small swords, they're pretty great, but there's one thing with them. They're kind of small. Now that is a sword. Now, back in the good old days, I'm thinking 1066, there was a big conquest of people coming in from France, descendants of the Vikings, descendants of the Scandinavians, coming down through Rollo all the way up into northern France, called the Normans. And the Normans, they took over a great swaths of England. Supposedly, they were promised the English throne. That's where William the Conqueror came in. He stormed up through, took that from the rightful king at the time, who was handed it directly by the king, fought off a bunch of Vikings, fought off a bunch more Vikings. Eventually, William the Conqueror took over England, portions of Wales, portions of Scotland, portions of Northern Ireland, and as they were conquering up through, they ran into the Irish Isles. Now, the Irish at the time, they were fairly low technology, fairly low quality of equipment. They spent a lot of time mostly doing cattle raids. There was no development, there was no conquering. A lot of it was literally just high kings sending people after each other's cows. And you can see that a lot with the modern clans. A lot of their rivalries in Ireland actually stem from those original cattle raids. So this is the era of the development of the people who would have used swords just like this one. Now, before we get into that, you'll notice that I'm wearing a beautiful back scabbard. Now, our back scabbard's historical? Kind of. There is one account of somebody, Dobringer. Here's the quote right here, basically saying that at some times, some people carried some swords on their back. Now, historically, we have no depictions of carrying around any kind of great sword or anything like that. So we're really left to guess how they would transport it. And you can see as I'm gesticulating all around here, having a back scabbard for transport is actually not a terrible idea. Now, of course, it's impossible to draw the sword from the back. You can see that I'm having a bit of an issue even reaching around to grab that. Basically, any sword bigger than about that would be impossible. However, if I'm wearing this around looking to look good in costume, looking to have a good time at like a Renaissance fair, this sword is great because you can have it on the back scabbard and it makes you look really, really cool. Now, getting back to the Gallowglass, after that original Norman conquest that ended around the First Crusade, there was a lot of Irishmen that had developed the technology to help combat these foreign invaders, these Normans, some parts of English, some parts of Anglo-Saxon influence. They started to develop a lot of the similar technology. So starting off at the beginning of the period of the Gallowglass, we start to see things very much like this as a primary weapon for a lot of the Gallowglass. Now this is the Dane axe by Arms and Armor, and you can see he's quite a substantial beastie. That's what the head looks like dead on. On the side, you can see it's a little rusty. I need to clean it up a little bit. But this sword filled a very similar function back in the day to things like Montante's two-handed swords later in period. Now, the Gallowglass, as I was saying, they were developing a lot of technology similar to what the Normans had, so it wasn't unfamiliar for them to have full sets of mail armor, some kind of a conical helm on top. As it later develops, they get more flat, sometimes with cheek pieces, things like that. They never really developed, as far as we can tell, into full plate armor. They kind of stuck with chainmail, an axe, perhaps something like a sword, especially earlier in period. Swords like these, early Norman conquest period swords. This one is the single-edged Viking sword by Belauer Arms. And big shield, one hand, spear in another, sword just like this. Fighting off mostly Irish peasants would be the primary people that they're going to be fighting. They are probably the heaviest infantry in Ireland at this point. Mostly what they're fighting is, like I said, peasants doing cattle raids, taking out people that are generally less well armored than they are. And as the Gallowglass develop, they start to become more and more of a warrior class. Now, warrior class, what does that mean? A hereditary group of people in their family line, where you'd have the first Gallowglass, hired by the Lord. He's a heavy infantry. Think of him more like a samurai or a knight, as we would conceptualize it. Now, the samurai, the knights, of course, they had their warrior class. Their job was to fight. Now, they're not farmers, they're not merchants. They don't develop any skills outside of fighting. So they are primarily just going to be there as that heavy infantry for the Lord. Now, the Lord, he would develop these heavy infantry. They would be obviously a hereditary bunch of guys. You'd have the Gallowglass walking out there with his massive axe, his sword, going out there. But obviously, it's impossible to field such a large group of heavy infantry without a specific structure in place to support them. Now, Irish, we didn't have a whole ton of experience in the warfare side of things for the general population. We had this hereditary warrior class, and then we'd need a lot more as support troops, as light infantry, as cavalry, as things that we wouldn't necessarily develop as a heavy infantry class. And that's where the Irish Kern come in, Kern. Now, the Irish Kern, their primary role in the battlefield is to be kind of like the Velites or the Velites of the Romans. They're going to be much more javelin-based light infantry, wearing nothing more than just like a padded jack, a gambeson, maybe a helmet, perhaps a small shield, a buckler, some javelins, perhaps even just a spear and a shield. They're more of the support roles, the let's outflank the enemy. And my job as a Gallowglass would be, I need to run in, I'm the heavy infantry, I'm the wedge of the spear going in to separate out the less well-armored in general, the less experienced troops, so that way we can envelop them, grab much more of a hammer and anvil tactic than we could do with just traditional light infantry doing a cattle raid. Now, there weren't a whole ton of experience with the Gallowglass in the historical record. Most of what we're pulling our information from is records outside of Ireland. Now, some of those records come from a Renaissance painter. His name is Albrecht Dürer. His big job, he was part of the German Renaissance. He was a contemporary for people like Michelangelo, for people like the Ninja Turtles that we think about, those Renaissance-y names that I have a hard time remembering. He, at one point, was traveling around, and he specialized very much in doing the still life portraits. Now, especially if we're thinking back like 300 years before then, a lot of the artwork that we have is obviously not super well to interpret. We have a lot of anatomy that's not really up and running like we do think of today. It's less like a portrait. A lot of that fell away with the Romans. Then after the Dark Ages, as the Renaissance began, they started doing a lot more of these still life photos. Now, Albrecht Dürer, he painted this portrait right here of what we believe to be a Gallowglass and his Kern support troops, his squires, his ashigaru if you're from Japan, walking around, and you can see that he is very notably carrying a sword just like this. Now, taking this off my back, this is a closer view of what this one looks like. This is the Valiant Armory McGary with a back scabbard all the way down to a beautiful shape. The sword stands about 5 foot 8 inches tall, which is pretty close to where I am. Now, with this sword being about the right size, a lot of manuals, Dobbringer being one of them, mention that typically you want a sword to be about head height and about the same width as you spreading your arms out, finger to finger, with a little bit extra on this end. Now, if I dispense with the scabbard here for a sec, let's go ahead and take a look at the blade. This is the blade on this guy. You can see we have a very traditional Irish wheel pommel hilt. There is not a whole ton of evidence that those would ever have been filled. There is some speculation that perhaps this used to be some kind of organic material on the inside. Based on the documentaries that I've watched, the museums that I've looked at, there is no evidence that anything was in there, actually, which just seems kind of weird. Perhaps what this was is some of the makers back in the day, it could be a stylistic choice, or it could even be to see that the tang goes all the way through and is peened right there. And you can kind of wiggle it around to see how well the sword was built. If it wiggles at all, then you might have some issues in your hilt, things like that. Perhaps it was even so we could cut that off, remove the peen, and then slide this out, so it'd be very easy to change out the hilt in the event of damage. This right there, that is the hilt right there. We've got a beautiful waist right here. Cord wrap, or leather wrap, with cord impressions on the inside right there. See if you can see that okay. Very traditional Gaelic little knots right here on the end. Those go back all the way into pretty much prehistory. You can look back into the Bronze Age, into the late Dark Ages. They're finding symbols like that very much on a lot of gravestones, things like that. This right here is the blade. If we're looking down there, we've got a beautiful fuller. You can see the Valiant Armory stamp. Whoop, right there. So, especially nowadays when there's so many fake makers out there, a lot of people will show you a sword online saying it's for sale, and this stamp appears quite frequently. Here's an interaction I had with somebody talking about Valiant Armory stuff, trying to sell it to me not too long ago, which obviously very fake, very rude. So if you see any stamp like this on that blade, it's from Valiant Armory. We have a very good fuller on the inside, proceeding all the way out to about 3/4 of the way down the blade. And this blade is sharp, so I'm trying not to cut myself on it. It then goes into a flat section towards the end, all the way up into a super broad point, which is reminiscent of a lot of the early Anglo-Saxon, Viking-era Scandinavian swords, where they're not necessarily very, very pointy. Now, what does that suggest to us? Perhaps that suggests to us that these were not meant to overcome lots and lots of mail armor at the point. Perhaps this was meant, like I said before, fighting off people that are generally less well-armored than you, taking out big sweeps, knocking out people, big sweepiness, and just making sure that nobody can really close the distance with you. This is not going to be a finesse weapon. Not to say that finesse doesn't have a part in it, but a big portion of this is literally just moving your sword around. And we've talked about it before with some other videos, that a lot of this was to overcome pike blocks and things like that, charging in, disrupting that, especially early, especially late Renaissance. If you're fighting people with literally just small hand axes, shields, and spears, this would be an absolutely devastating weapon to just clear, absolutely wrecking out people that are generally less well armored and less well trained than you are. Now, looking here, I just have a normal personal weight scale. If you want to be super easy about how to weigh a sword, what you can do is you take this, you step on it. I'm going to set this down right here on my axe. Whoop. We step on the scale. Whoop. My weight without the sword, and with all my gear on, we're at 197.6. Now reset. With the sword, we were at 202.6. So that makes this just about 4 pounds, which is incredible. All right, let's go ahead and talk about some of the specs on this guy. First off, the sword. I double measured it, putting it on my toe. We're about 5 feet 8 inches tall. I'm about 5'10", maybe a little bit shorter with my boots on. Pretty close to exactly what you want for a greatsword. Pulling out my calipers, which for those of you who don't know, calipers are meant to measure precise width. They're usually used in automotive, but this is a great way to kind of see what the sword is looking like under a microscope almost. So let's go ahead and turn them on. First things first, I'm going to go ahead and measure out width of the hilt. So starting right here, width of the pommel, we are looking at 0.41 inches, 0.46 at the waist, whoop, at the base of the hilt, base of the hilt where your hand goes, we are looking at 0.38, base of the waist, whoop, 0.80. Now, one of the complaints that I've heard with this sword, is really the only complaint, is that perhaps this is a bit too wide of a grip for people. You can see I can fairly easily hold that, so I interpret that more of as a skill issue. Right, the grip. Now, the one complaint that I've heard with this sword, the only complaint that I've heard, is perhaps this is a little bit big for some people. Originally, this sword was made for an NFL football player called Mr. McGary. I forget his first name. I'll attach a picture over here somewhere. His hands fit perfectly in this. My hands fit pretty okay in it. If your hands don't fit in it, either you have small hands or it's a skill issue, would be my opinion. So, right here, 1.11 at the top of the waist. We have 1.05, so we have a slight taper going up into the hilt. Hilt right here across. Whoop. We're looking at the depth of the guard right across through there. We're at 0.33, 0.34 inches. Whoop. It's perfect on both sides of it. At the ricasso, so the ricasso being this piece right here before it starts being ground out, we're at 0.26, tapers down to 0.24 right at the top of the ricasso. halfway up the fuller, we're at 0.18, so you can see we have a pretty dramatic taper going up towards the top. At the end of the fuller, whoop, we have 0.17, so still tapering out towards the top. And then right towards the point, right here before it tapers off to the end, we're looking at 0.14. So you can see there's a pretty dramatic distal taper going all the way through. Not only a distal, but a little bit of a profile taper. It's kind of hard to see, and obviously it's a very intimidating sword, but I can quite easily hold this out in one hand. Now that's something that's not very common with a sword of this size, which leads you to believe it's a really good sword. A lot of the budget area of swords, whoop, are more familiar with this bad boy right here. You can see this one is obviously quite a bit heavier. This is the Hanwei Lowlander that we talked about in some earlier videos. It's a very fun sword to cut with, but it's not really a good example of what these would have looked like historically, mainly because it is so freaking heavy. All right, if we take a step on my scale, whoop, with this one, if it'll work, we are at 204 pounds. So this sword is just about 5 or 6 pounds, making it an easily 20 to 25% heavier than that other one for not all that much more reach. And this one, we're working off double disadvantages with it because the tang on this actually unscrews. So we can see the base of the tang. Whoop. Go ahead and keep the guard together. This is a sword that you can end people rightly with. Graphic and description. Whoop. The tang on this one is super, super, super weak sauce. So they didn't use a whole ton of metal in the tang, meaning that most of our weight is actually going to be from the blade. So you can see there, we've got a little tiny rat tail tang at the end. Obviously not very good, so I wouldn't recommend taking this to your medieval battlefield. They hollowed out the pommel to try and reduce the weight a little bit, but it's still pretty weak sauce when it comes to weight distribution. So this is a great beginner's greatsword, but it is nothing close to what Valiant Armory produces. So just as kind of a comparison between what different greatswords look like on the market right now.
If you were a loved one was diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be entitled to financial compensation.
All right, and that is the Valiant Armory McGary right there. Beautiful piece, wonderful makers. Sonny over at Valiant is awesome. Zach does all the scabbard work and a lot of the blades himself. Super awesome. They'll be at Combat Con this year if you guys want to pick up anything they have. Their whole lines are amazing. They're beautiful. They all cut very well. You don't have to worry about that if you're looking for a sword to cut with. Yeah, there's pretty much nothing I can do to complain about this one. Like I said, maybe the grip is a little bit big for you. I'm sure they can customize that fairly easy, especially since this is a bespoke piece. They'd be happy to. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other issues with it. I give it like a 10 out of 10 for how cool it is. But that right there is the Valiant Armory McGary. Ready.
Oh, that is a big boy.
What does it feel like?
It feels good. It feels gigantic. I feel like I can take a horse's head off with it. But it's not unbound, it's not clumsy. I feel like I can hold it at extension.
Just raw power. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, let me move this. Oh!
So talk about it. What do you say?
Longsword? Longsword?
Talk about it.
Man, that's
How does it feel?
really heavy. That's cool though. Yeah.
Well, first thing that's really cool about this is it comes with a scabbard. I think that's fucking awesome. I like. What can I guess swear? Alright, so I like the guard. It's really pretty good shape. A little chunky here, maybe. Feels cool. They're almost feels like it's pretty magical. I like the handle, I like the color. The core drop's really nice. I think it's just a little too chunky though. It's like a little too big. Even for like big hands.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's cool. I give it like a... Yeah, I'd fight you with it, you know?